Hello everyone, my name is Maria Medina-Vicent. I'm a PhD student at Universitat Jaume I in Castellón, Spain. Nowadays, I research in business ethics and feminist political theory. First of all, I would like to thank the organizing committee for allowing me to share my research work with you. Today, I'm going to talk about the depolitization of feminism through popular management literature. The popular management literature that addresses women reflects the management discourse about women's presence in today's companies. In order to examine this phenomenon in detail, we center on the work of sociologists like Abramson, Collins, Greatback, Clark, and Jackson. To begin with, we must point out that such literature not only combines a series of ideas present in economic thought, but influences the performance of the manager in modern business organizations. Such works represent the dominant ideology of companies' management levels because it is a tool of the new spirit of capitalism. Such literature normally centers on the works written by these so-called management gurus, who occupy prestigious posts in the business world. They tend to be men who have had successful careers in the business or academic world, and who present business success cases as examples to imitate. Nowadays, this also addresses women, and we need to reflect on this phenomenon in order to identify the status of gender equality in their discourse. For this reason, if we bear in mind that such discourse represents the ideology of those who hold power within business organizations, then approaching this literature will allow us to identify companies' perception of the gender equality issue. We highlight that popular management literature uses the typical individualism language of self-help literature to depolitize women's struggle for equality inside and outside the company. This gives them a strong psychological character, which implies that the tips built in this literature refer to changes that women should make from within, in their personality or psychology, and not in social structures. Although this fact would not necessarily harm the fight for gender equality, our task is to consider if the gender equality conception communicated through these books is a step toward equality, or if these books support differences from the patriarchal logic of inequality. So we can state that a tendency exists in popular management literature for women to support the internalization of social problems and the consequent depolitization of feminism. This implies that the discourse on gender equality present in such works reproduce essentialist and not very transformative ideas. This discourse is not convenient as we need to increase ethics in the company. At this point, we can state that these works contain a tendency to play conservative essentialism which, while possibly serving to increase the presence of women in positions of corporate governance, a traditional and sexist space, does not contain the elements of social transformations needed to produce a substantial change toward gender equality in companies. 5 works make up the sample analyzed in the present research, which were selected from the theoretical corpus that comprises 150 works. There are 4 main issues of interest dealt within the analyzed sample, which provide us with a general idea of the problems reflected in the main body of the popular management literature. First, maternity and conciliating the work and personal life of professional women. Second, mentoring women in companies. Third, a soft discourse about gender equality in the company in particular and in society in general. Fourth and finally, the neoliberal premises of self-demandingness and self-exploring that constantly come over in them. After their analysis, we identified the triple nature that, as we see it, best characterizes the popular management literature which addresses women. It is psychologic, aspirational, and depoliticized. These premises work in an interconnected manner to create a conservative type discourse on the presence of women in companies, which offers us a purely critical conception of the gender equality problem in this domain. One first trait we found in all the analyzed works was their psychologic nature. The pieces of advice that are built on such works particularly refer to the changes that women must make from within themselves and in their personality or psychology in order to increase their self-esteem and efficiency at work. Rather than encouraging women to come together, to be critical about their surroundings, and to act together to favor equality, they are pressed to solve their individual problems, which tend to be identified more by internal issues than by external ones. The type of empowerment that this literature attempts to achieve could be identified as being a spiritual kind that centers on the individual rather than on the group. And although it may promote life changes in individuals, it does not transform our society's inequality structures. The predominant terms in this text are self, internal, mindful, feelings, emotions. These concepts focus on exploring each reader's interior, their fears and hopes. Below is a list of some examples of what we'd refer to. All these statements, which we have taken from the studied works, transmit the idea of finding oneself, of exploring one's own personality and self-esteem. As we can see, this is quite a spiritual approach of the phenomenon that we are examining, women occupying high company positions. In this way, female readers are led to focus so much on themselves that they cannot critically establish a multidimensional and structural explanation for their problems in the company. Using psychological language limits their outlook to that which everyone can do for their future. At the same time, it is worth pointing out an interesting phenomenon that comes over in such works, where we can observe how the neoliberal spirit intermingles with the psychologistic nature that we are dealing with. In other words, exploring emotions to serve the new capitalism's interests and needs is reflected in the popular management literature. From our point of view, this framework of discourse operation serves as an incentive for the idea of personally clearing the hurdles that each woman faces, which, in this case, can also be found in the working world. By placing these hurdles within each woman's interior, patriarchal structures are exonerated, and women are blamed for their situation and are urged to be the leading figures of their destiny. This twin nature is linked to another aspirational nature through which women are pressed to substantially change their attitudes in order to be successful and to triumph in their respective posts. Here, success is defined as a road that must be walked alone by experiencing failures from which one can learn to improve. We can see that linking both components, the psychological and aspirational natures, allows them to come together to create a totally acritical and depoliticized discourse as regards the gender equality status in companies. Here, the risk culture is clearly perceived with which women come into play in a neoliberal market by commercializing their capacities in a zero-sum game. So, it is not surprising that issues like maternity, conciliation, equal pay, or access to responsible positions are dealt with as if they were personal self-development matters, instead of matters of collective interest and claims. By forming part of the mainstream self-help discourses, the popular management literature pathologizes and demobilizes women's discontents. So, no matter what problems are examined on their pages, an individual approach is used. One of the clearest examples, and a very generalized problem, of this matter has been superficially dealt with: sexual harassment in the working world. In the work by Annis and Gray, this problem and others in relationships between men and women in the workplace boil down to a problem of understanding. That is, these problems are stated as simply being the consequence of men and women talking different languages. Thus, the structural and power explanation is left to one side. In the work by Bennington, we can also observe this tendency to put the blame for harassment on the victim rather than on the harasser. Women are advised to minimize the possibilities of this incident from happening by being urged to dress appropriately and to avoid establishing relationships with work colleagues or tolerating certain sexist jokes. Although we understand that the intention of the pieces of advice offered in these works is to help women advance in their professional careers, we consider that certain aspects should not be recommended. Indeed, the gender problem in companies is not due to communication among individuals, but to business structure dynamics. Equal pay, which is just one of the many gender inequality facets on the business world, is also dealt with in a somewhat individualistic manner, when it is actually a social issue. Although it is an issue that should in many cases be dealt with trade unions and other company-related groups, these works deal with it as if it were a problem that can be simply solved by asking for a rise. So even though the women in the cases presented in these works actually obtain a rise in salary, this does not mean that they have made an overall change for other women in the company. After dealing with the most relevant characteristics that we identify in our analysis, we are able to indicate that the feminist struggle in these works is taken as a totally secondary matter and becomes a matter managed by each woman on her own. This explains the reluctance shown by female authors of expressly talking about feminism, and their preference to use terms like equality or equity. From our point of view, the individualistic and depoliticized construction of women being present in companies that comes over in such works actually responds to the requirements of the new spirit of capitalism. As with the self-help literature, popular management literature is the result of the mass culture and is therefore characterized by stereotyping contents and orientating them to the market. Hence, it is highly prescriptive and moralizing in nature, which reaches the general public and will, to a great extent, shape part of today's social imaginary. The popular management literature is framed within what Israeli sociologist Eva Youth calls emotional capitalism. Her central thesis refers to capitalism's need to establish an emotional culture in individuals' lives that reproduces the logics of exchanging the economic system itself. As we see it, the popular management literature is a key instrument in shaping this pro-capitalist emotional culture and in diffusing it among companies' executives. One of the ways by which this individuality language is established in both the social domain and in companies is through the autonomy idea, which loses its original meaning and moves on to refer to the obligation that everyone has to shoulder the weight of their own failure in the market. According to Ulrich Beck and Elizabeth Beck-Gernsheim, the autonomy notion in self-help tells us about finding biographical solutions to systemic contradictions in the heart of a society in which individualization and isolation have been converted into collective experiences of an identitary meaning. So we understand that the values diffused through this literature type are not free, and that the vision of autonomy as an individual responsibility as opposed to social problems responds to an interest in legitimizing capitalism. In a liquid society and one with fierce capitalism, an individual must be empowered if she or he does not wish to be left out of the system. If the individual fails, the weight of this failure will fall on his or her shoulders, and she or he must get up and expect no help from other individuals or institutions. From this perspective, social structures are not conditioning factors for individuals' failures or success. However, reality does not fall in line with this idea if we are to understand that both failure and success are subject to different variables in a person's life. As Richard Sennett points out, individuals enter the capitalist game without having any control over the structures in which this particular gamble is played, and without being entitled to discuss the rules. And so it is that a cultural operation comes into play by means of which solutions to problems are found within individuals, and the role played by the state and companies to seek this solution is denied. As sociologist Vanina Papalini states, no external reality exists to the psyche that prevents the purposes that everyone says being met. It only seems a subjective matter, and what actually matters is how each individual feels, and how she or he perceives his, herself, and his, her situation. Therefore, the popular management literature that addresses women shows absolutely no interest in systematically explaining social problems, as it places the responsibility of finding the solution in individuals' hands, and in untying the links that bind women together. Consequently, in its confluences with self-help, The management literature allows anyone to control their emotions and permits them to come into play in the market by enabling them to acquire behavior based on self-fulfillment, seeking success, and self-control from an instrumental conception. The responsibility of surviving in the new capitalism spirit depends on everyone's individual action, which is absolutely incompatible with the feminist struggle. So we conclude that the popular management literature depoliticizes feminism. Thank you so much.